St. Paul wrote that Jesus spoke to him on the road to Damascus when Paul was struck down by something like lightning. And Jesus said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9, Aramaic Bible in plain English. Those are the final words spoken by Jesus in the Bible outside the book of Revelation. And God is not only a great comedian, but he's also a scientist. And the scientist Darwin had gained great popularity by 1935 because the world was starved for something other than the rehashing of the stories in the Bible. Science had been all the rage when the big book was written in 1935, and the AAs were unanimous in their agreement that the book was supposed to be scientific. So an entire chapter was entitled "We Agnostics," where they talked about science, while no chapter needed to be written to religious people. The AA people thought that constitutionally incapable meant genetically inclined, and the Germans wanted to prove that the Jews could overcome their genetic predisposition towards laziness, and so the concentration camps were structured to prove that people could be taught to work despite the science of their given genes. And the Nazi program worked so well that half the workers on board the Cap Arcona had been Jewish. So many who were forced to work in the camps had chosen to just lay down and die, as so had many in the Donner Party, and so had many in the Donner Party. And Heidegger's warning to the Nazis of the danger of group loyalty was proven by those members of the Donner Party who'd stuck together and died one after the other, just as those huddling together in the Forlorn Hope group had met with the tragedy that Reed escaped as he made it out on his own. While the rest of the world was arguing about the tenets of religion, the British had gifted the world with scientific societies, and from this utopian dream rose the Royal Society of London, which received a royal charter from Charles II of England in 1662. The essential use and virtue of this society was and is publication. Its formation marks a definite step from isolated inquiry towards cooperative work, from the secret and solitary investigations of the alchemist to the frank report and open discussion, which is the life of the modern scientific process. For the true scientific method is this: to make no unnecessary hypothesis, to trust no statements without verification, to test all things as rigorously as possible, to keep no secrets, to attempt no monopolies, to give out one's best modestly and plainly, serving no other end but knowledge. The Outline of History by H.G. Wells, New York Doubleday and Company, Inc., 1920, 1949, 1961, page 607. The Royal Society sponsored expeditions, sending mad dogs and Englishmen far out into the unknown, and the last place on earth to be mapped was the African Congo, followed by the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. The Congo River was the second largest in Africa after the Nile River, and the Congo River was the gateway to what the civilized world called the Heart of Darkness. Joseph Conrad had been born in Poland and went to sea when he was 16 years old, and he learned to speak English, and he wrote his first successful novel in 1821, where Conrad described what it was to be, quote, men enough to face the darkness, close quote. The Heart of Darkness and the Secret Sharer by Joseph Conrad, New York Bantam Classic, 1982, page 69. Land in a swamp, march through the woods, and in some inland post feel the savagery, the utter savagery had closed round him, all that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forest, in the jungles, in the hearts of wild men. There's no initiation either into such mysteries. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable, and it has a fascination, too, that goes to work upon him, the fascination of the abomination, you know. Imagine the growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerless disgust, the surrender, the hate. Ibid. These adventurous British made friends all over the world who could be called upon when needed to lend succor in the cause of the crown, and Britain needed Palestine as a naval base to protect its sea lanes to India, and that meant making friends with Muslims. The British also held bases in Kenya and in Egypt and in Libya, and in the summer of 1909, Lawrence of Arabia set out alone on a 3-month walking tour of crusader castles in Ottoman Syria, and he discovered that gay sex was part of Islamic culture. The Muslim Iranians would miss out on a big opportunity in 1974 to launch a news service to counter the Persian BBC, a news agency started by 7 Arab states around the Persian Gulf that they wanted to call the Arabian Gulf News Agency, but the Shah was opposed to the Arabs trying to change the name of Persian Gulf to Arabian Gulf and put an end to any alternative news in Iran. Despite being at war with each other, all the Islamic countries had adopted the same red, green, white, and black colors of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and the Jews they befriended had fulfilled only the first half of the 7 festivals, all of which revolved around the remembrance of being brought out of bondage in Egypt rather than having drowned in the Red Sea of wine. And Bill W. wrote in the Big Book that, quote, "half measures availed us nothing." God's timing is perfect because he works in the 4th dimension, something that Albert Einstein had figured out using math. And in his special relativity theory, Einstein discovered that time was the 4th dimension, and the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous mentioned the 4th dimension twice. God knows the beginning from the end, and Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, and everyone learns that a narrow path is a troublesome path. And when therefore we were approached by those in whom the problem had been solved, there was nothing left for us but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. We have found much of heaven, and we have been rocketed into a 4th dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 25. How dark it is before the dawn! In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the 4th dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Ibid, page 8. Since the first steam locomotive was built in 1812, it had taken the British only 100 years to bring down the Ottoman Caliphate, and they'd done it right after Einstein discovered that time was the 4th dimension. The search for science had been a quest for comfort and mercy in the face of an arbitrary deity, and communism was considered to be scientific, and for those more in love with science than with faith in God. For that reason, the idea of communism had been especially appealing. If science was morality, then it was the duty of all good men to pursue it, and the love of everything good had always been carried in the heart of the King of France. And the French had a saying, "To understand is to forgive, because to understand God is to love God." The Norwegians had a saying, "Tell me and I'll know, show me and I'll remember, let me do it myself and I'll understand." And Louis XVI's mother had been born in Dresden to an Austrian mother married to the King of Poland. And Louis XVI would marry Marie Antoinette, whose mother was Maria Theresa of Austria. When the revolutionaries in France killed Louis XVI in January of 1793, they took away Marie Antoinette's 7-year-old son Louis Charles, who would die as a prisoner at age 10 with his body covered in scars. Pharamond had been the first king of France in the year 420, and Clovis after him had been the first king of France to become a Christian, and Marie Antoinette was killed 9 months after they killed her husband Louis XVI, and they smuggled her son's heart away during the autopsy to be kept as a Catholic relic. Clovis had been born in Tournai in the year 466, and he'd gone to live in the holy city of Cologne on the Rhine, where the 3 Magi were buried. And in 1935, it wasn't science that was evil in Germany, but what people were doing with it. The medical experiments being performed by Nazi doctors were not scientific, such as injecting bleach into brown eyes to make them a lighter color, or freezing people to see how long downed pilots could survive in the North Sea. And while science was taking a step backwards during Hitler's war, George Orwell was writing Animal Farm, that would first be published in 1946. And in case anyone missed the point of the story in Animal Farm, George Orwell bestowed the name of Napoleon upon the barnyard's pig leader, who was more equal than the others. C.M. Woodhouse wrote an introduction in the Signet paperback edition of the New American Library in 1956 from Harcourt, Brace and Company, Inc., where Woodhouse said that the only morality in Animal Farm was, quote, "Don't take to drink and let your animals get out of hand," close quote. George Orwell had written Animal Farm as a warning to the English when they were preparing to cast ballots after Hitler's war. And when the voters failed to get the message, he wrote 1984 in 1948. George Orwell had been born in India, where his father worked in the opium department of the Indian Civil Service, and his mother had been born in Burma, where her French father had been involved in, quote, "speculative ventures," close quote. American England were two brothers born of a common language, and the second would rule the firstborn, and the British had been crippled by their resentment towards Russia for having withdrawn in 1799 from the Second Coalition to stop Napoleon, making it that much harder to defeat the revolutionary French. According to the Big Book, resentment is the #1 offender, and Napoleon had been forced to become an emperor in the face of the stiff British resistance, and he became an emperor so that the European nobility would accept him as their legitimate neighbor. Thereafter, the British crown encouraged the Church of England to peg Russia as the land of Gog and Magog rather than its being Turkey, while the sale of the best Turkish opium on the planet kept the Ottoman Muslims firmly in control of the Holy Land, despite the best bargaining chips the British had to offer. As Hitler's war had been spreading out over old Europe, the peace of AA was spreading across America. And after Hitler's war, the dangerous error of which Heidegger had warned descended as Germans were held guilty of intentionally murdering Jews. And to punish Germany, or perhaps to distract from their own complicity in the Holocaust, radical Islamic terrorists were paid to infiltrate unchecked into the fatherland, and 70 years later, it would take 20 lawyers, 40 FBI agents, 500 search warrants, 2,800 subpoenas, and $42 million to find out that Americans had elected Donald Trump so that America could be friends with Russia, in large part because President Putin knew how to deal with radical Islamists. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin would declare the following to the motherland. In Russia live Russians. Any minority from anywhere, if it wants to live in Russia, to work and eat in Russia, should speak Russian and should respect the Russian laws. If they prefer Sharia law and live the life of Muslims, then we advise them to go to those places where that's the state law. Russia does not need Muslim minorities. Minorities need Russia, and we will not grant them special privileges or try to change our laws to fit their desires, no matter how loud they scream discrimination. We will not tolerate disrespect of our Russian culture. We had better learn from the suicides of America, England, Holland, and France if we are to survive as a nation. The Muslims are taking over those countries, and they will not take over Russia. The Russian customs and traditions are not compatible with the lack of culture or the primitive ways of Sharia law and Muslims. When this honorable legislative body thinks of creating new laws, it should have in mind the Russian national interest first, observing that the Muslim minorities are not Russians. At this, the politicians in the Duma gave Putin a 5-minute standing ovation. The French Revolution hadn't been so much about getting rid of God as it had been a great hope that in abolishing the throne of the King of France, perhaps the English across the Channel would stop wanting to come over to claim the title of King of France for themselves. The guillotine had been a terror to French Catholics who thought it important to be buried unmutilated, believing that God would only resurrect them into the next life if their bodies had gone properly into the grave. The faithful European nobility had rejoiced at the final defeat of Napoleon in 1814, because it had been 1,000 years since Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, had died in 814, and they saw the restoration of the divinely appointed nobility in Europe at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 as being a very big deal indeed. Many had believed that Napoleon was the Antichrist, knocking God's anointed off their thrones, and restoring the nobility at the Congress of Vienna heralded the new kingdom of God in Europe. And because Europe encompassed all of the civilized world, the Congress of Vienna had resurrected the legitimate rule of God's kingdom on earth. Prussia received the Rhineland in 1814, and the Kingdom of Hanover was born. And exactly 100 years later, the Great War would break out, and it would be called the War to Make the World Safe for Democracy. Because Austria had not helped their French friends in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, Bismarck rewarded Austria by allowing them to move back into their lovely port of Trieste. Austria was also given Bosnia and Herzegovina, wherein the Muslims had made themselves comfortable, and even though the Russians and the Austrian Habsburgs had been at war with the Ottoman Muslims for a very long time, Austria had been making friends with the Muslim Turks in hope of gaining some leverage over keeping Britain out of Turkey. The Ottomans brutally suppressed the Bulgarian uprising of 1876, and the Muslims massacred almost 100,000 people, and that prompted Europe to step in with the Conference of Constantinople in January of 1877, the upshot of which was that Europe was unable to convince Disraeli that Russia's offer to keep the Muslims in Serbia at bay was not a Russian trick to take over Constantinople. Disraeli was insisting that the British would go to any lengths to protect their sea lanes to India, even if it meant aligning themselves with the Muslims, and because of Disraeli's obstinance, the task of protecting Christians in Serbia fell to Austria rather than to Russia. The British had agreed because they cut some kind of a deal with the Muslim Turks, yet unknown to History Anonymous, and the Russians launched the Russo-Turkish War right away after the Conference of Constantinople, and it took the Russians 10 months to win that war, which gifted to Serbia and Romania and Montenegro their freedom from Islamic rule. Because the Conference of Constantinople gave Bosnia-Herzegovina to Austria, Britain was given Cyprus, and from Cyprus, Britain sent troops into Egypt in 1882 under the pretext of helping the Ottoman government put down the Urabi revolt, and that would leave Egypt ostensibly as a British colony until 1952. The Ottomans had conquered Egypt in 1517, and under their rule, the Egyptians suffered a half-dozen severe famines and 100 smaller ones, and Egypt lost to starvation 17% of its population in 1784, after which the British came and planted cotton in 1820 after Napoleon had finally been defeated. The atrocities committed by Muslims trying to move up through the Balkans into Europe had reached such levels of horror by 1862 that all of Europe told the Muslim Turks to back out of Serbia, and they dragged their feet. But they dragged their feet. By 1876, the Serbians had gotten strong enough to declare war on the Ottoman Muslims, while the Christians in Bulgaria and in Bosnia-Herzegovina were also rising up against the Islamic Turks, and with the Conference of Constantinople, Austria was given the opportunity to help Serbia keep the Muslims restrained, but instead the Serbian king and queen were helping the Austrians to persecute Orthodox Russians. The Patriarch of the Armenian Apostolic Church was named Crimean, and he went to the Conference of Constantinople in January of 1877 to seek advice about keeping the Muslim Turks out of Armenia. And when he found no help there, Patriarch Crimean turned to Russia, who commenced the Russo-Turkish War in April of 1877 in partnership with the Bulgarians. Just as they reached Constantinople, the British sent battleships and insisted that Russia accept the Turkish offer of surrender and send Russian emissaries to the Congress of Berlin to sign revised terms in the summer of 1878. In Berlin, Macedonia was given back to the Ottoman Muslims, and Russian gains were severely curtailed, leaving them unable to help the Armenians unless the Tsar wanted war with Britain, who had been mobilizing the previous fall in 1877 under Disraeli to fight Russia so the British could save Constantinople for their friends the Muslim Turks, who had appealed to Disraeli for help. The Armenian Apostolic Church was in the town of Van on the shore of Lake Van, and it was the oldest Christian church in the world, and from 1894 to 1896, between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians were murdered by Islamic Turks because the Armenians had been reaching out to Russia for protection. It had been easy to get the Muslims to slaughter the Armenians because the Christians in Turkey had a higher standard of living due to their better schools and superior culture, while the Muslim schools taught only the Quran, which was written in the difficult Arabic language, and study of the Quran had a heavy emphasis on memorization. Greeks were still the majority of businessmen in the Turkish world, and the rest of Europe failed to help the Armenians, many of whom fled to Russia. The Serbian military also wanted to ally with Russia rather than with the Austrians, who were trying to make deals with the Ottomans in order to put through the Berlin to Baghdad railroad so they could ship Turkish opium up into Europe without having to sail up the Adriatic Sea from the Mediterranean, where they would inevitably encounter the British Royal Navy. The Austrians wanted to prop up the Ottoman Turks for that reason, and construction of the railroad was awarded to an Ottoman company in 1903, but the Russians warned the Austrians that doing business with Muslims was not a good idea, and when mercenaries were dispatched to murder the Serbian royal family 2 years later, the question History Anonymous must ask is, who would benefit from stopping the Berlin to Baghdad railroad going through Belgrade? The King and Queen of Serbia had become friendly with Austria in 1903 because they had envisioned the riches that would accrue from the opium trade into Europe via the railroad through the Balkans. And in June of 1903, a couple dozen armed men gathered at several drinking establishments around town, and in the middle of the night they went to the Serbian palace and cut the electricity and dynamited the royal bedroom door and murdered the royal family, and they also killed a handful of the royal family's friends. The Austrians could have cut Russia into the railroad deal by simply giving them Serbia and then paid to Russia reasonable tariffs or transfer fees, which would have avoided the Great War. And History Anonymous has yet to solve the mystery of why that didn't happen. Some historians said that the Austrian military killed Franz Ferdinand in 1914 to get a war going so that the Roman Catholic Austrians could get rid of the Russian Orthodox Serbs in Serbia, but the religious angle was just a vain attempt in the aftermath to explain how the Great War had gotten started. According to that theory, instead of joining forces with Russia against the Islamists, the Austrians had asked the German Kaiser if they could get away with a quick war in 1914 to expel the Russian Orthodox Serbs from Serbia. And the Kaiser had assured Austria that Russia would never go to war over Serbia, but he was wrong. The Kaiser had given Austria his promise that Germany would support the Austrians in their Serbian adventure, since the Kaiser needed that railroad going through to Germany from the Turkish opium fields. And he had no idea how lucrative that venture could become, with more than plenty of profit affording a pittance. more than plenty of profit, affording a pittance to the Russians in Serbia for transit over their tracks. So, for lack of knowledge about the poppy business, the Kaiser thought it expedient to stand up to the Tsar. The Austrian military was overly prepared for some hot battlefield exercises after having warmed up during the Balkan Wars. And the Ottoman Muslims had lost the Balkan Wars in October 1912 to May 1913, and loss of their Islamic control in the Balkans had stoked their hatred towards Christians, which would bring on the genocide of over 1.5 million more Armenians starting in 1914, which they committed against the Armenians under cover of the Great War, so they could pretend it had been a military exercise. The Ottoman Muslims had been defeated in the Balkan Wars because the Europeans were finally working together to defeat them, and around 400,000 Muslims had fled from the Balkans into Turkey, where many of them died in a cholera epidemic. By 1914, the Muslims had been driven out of nearly all of Europe and North Africa, although they still controlled 28 million people, half of them in Turkey and the rest in Greater Arabia. The expulsion of the Turkish Muslims from the Balkans resulted in Greece, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria entering the vacuum to fight over their own borders in the Second Balkan War during the summer of 1913. But the main sticking point making the Great War inevitable had been the creation of Albania in the Treaty of London after the First Balkan War. Because after all the sacrifice provided by Serbia, the Serbs were cut off from the sea by the formation of a new country called Albania that was 50 miles wide and 200 miles long, and should have belonged to Serbia, and for that swindle the Serbs were blaming Austria. The Ottomans sided with the Austrians in the Great War in hopes of getting some of their previous conquests back, and with the defeat in 1918, the Sultan lost his caliphate and left Turkey on the 17th of November in 1922, and the Grand National Assembly declared the Republic of Turkey on the 29th of October in 1923. The Caliphate itself was outlawed on the 3rd of March in 1924, and the Ottoman Empire died with a fizzle rather than with a bang. The Serbian military's primary goal had been to neutralize the Muslim Turks, and the Austrians' primary goal had been to put that railroad through from Constantinople to Belgrade to Berlin, even if they had to make a deal with the devil to get it done. And while Russia was willing to help the Serbian military deal with the Muslims, the Austrians had been laser-focused on that railroad. In 1914, the Austrians had still been accusing the Black Hand from Venice of breaking into the royal Serbian palace and murdering the king and queen in 1903. And Austria sent a 10-point ultimatum to Serbia, and one of the points was that Austrian and Hungarian police were to be allowed to come into Serbia so they could wipe out the Black Hand, which would be like the UN coming in America to wipe out the Hells Angels. Not a good idea. The Austrians had been accusing the Black Hand of murdering the king and queen to cover up their own complicity in the massacre, and Serbians had been preparing for war in 1914 because they'd had nothing to do with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand either. Franz Ferdinand had not wanted war at all, but had been planning to turn the Balkan region into separate provinces modeled after the United States. Provinces modeled after the United States. And the Austrian military didn't like that idea at all, and they also didn't want any Serb participation in the government. The Austrians wanted to run their part of the Great War themselves without having to answer to Germany about anything, because it was supposed to be just a short local war in Serbia, and they thought that Russia would stay out due to the threat of Germany coming in. Germany had asked Russia to stop mobilizing several times because all the Germans were out on harvest leave so the crops could be brought in as the summer wound down. But thanks to the railroads, the speed of Russian mobilization would seal Germany's fate, even though the Germans would begin to win on the Eastern Front soon enough. But the Schlieffen Plan had bogged down in the West from the very beginning. As soon as the war began, Austria had been asked to hold off the Russians temporarily, so Germany could invade Belgium and France, and the fight on the Western Front would keep the French from helping Russia, and the Austrians, facing Russia, lost its entire professional army in the first 5 months, over 1 million men. The two generals leading the Austrian army had argued, one wanting to invade Bosnia before turning around to fight Russia, and the train schedules had gotten screwed up, and as trench warfare dug in and no amount of countermeasures could break the murderous stalemate, halfway through the Great War, Germany allowed Lenin's train to pass through the fatherland into Russia, calculating that some revolutionist disruption would help the German soldiers who were in the trenches facing Russia. Bringing down Russia would give the British some excuse to negotiate with the Kaiser, and Disraeli and his successors had cultivated extensive contacts with anti-Russian agitators all over the world, because Disraeli had not been able to see past his fear that Russia wanted to unite all the Orthodox Christians so Mother Russia could protect them from Islamic terror, and Disraeli had seen all Russia's actions as merely being a threat to Jews. Mohammed had been born in the year of the elephant, and it would take until after the Japanese surrender in 1945 to come up with a solution to the problem of Islam by using the Shinto plan, since the devil had told Mohammed that the Ummah was above the individual. If the Holocaust happened again, we would have the choice of wearing a triangle in a circle or taking a drink. And the growth of AA after Hitler's war was helped along by the general abhorrence of anyone being sent away for special treatment, or being branded as medically unfit, or encouraging children to rat out their parents, or the authorities requiring parents to turn their children over for indoctrination. After the failure of Nazism, there was no appetite for allowing the state to usurp jurisdiction over facing alcoholism, and the churches were in no position to put themselves forward as moral authorities because they were being blamed for the Holocaust, so the question of alcoholism had been left in private hands after Hitler's war, specifically in the hands of the family, who were more often than not a substantial part of the problem. Elizabeth I's mother, Anne Boleyn, had been a poppy juice drinker, which explained the large, mysterious eyes that had fascinated Henry VIII enough to kick the Catholic Church out of England so he could start his own religion. And 100 years after Henry VIII met with the King of France at the Cloth of Gold near Calais on the 7th of June in 1520, his successor, King James VI, hated the Puritans so much that he gave them such a bad time that they willingly climbed on board the Mayflower for the arduous journey over the Atlantic to the New World. When Bill W. called Dr. Bob from the Mayflower Hotel in Akron, Ohio in 1935, people in America had been accusing the Oxford groups of being anti-Christian because the good people of America thought that the only solution to our troubles was the second coming of Jesus in the flesh, and who could argue with that? A Nazi report written in November of 1936, marked secret, said that Frank Buchmann was a dangerous opponent to National Socialism because the groups were too Christian, which meant that they were tainted with Judaism and thus were hung up on guilt and atonement. The Nazi report complained that the Oxforders were attracting women to the movement, while in Germany, women were supposed to be staying home raising children instead of attending the meetings and visiting the homes of strangers for house parties. The ancient German folk stories had not been about superheroes, but were tales of confused, wounded warriors, and the point of the story was always that love and truth could only be found after becoming lost and having suffered wounds. Al Gore said that there were 6 years of crop failure before the 1789 French Revolution, and that May had been the coldest on record, so the wine harvest had failed completely that year. And in 1815, a volcano in Indonesia erupted and lowered the temperature of the planet a full degree. And some scientists claimed that a drop of only 1.5 degrees of temperature long term would bring about another ice age. It had taken only 12 days for the tropospheric winds to disperse the volcano's ashes around the globe, and as a result, there was no summer that year, so Mary Shelley had stayed indoors and written her Frankenstein story. America had been more than reluctant to get involved in Hitler's war, and it wasn't that they hated war so much as they thought that Hitler was right. And many had believed and hoped that Hitler was actually the Messiah. After the war, a majority of Americans were sympathetic about the Germans having, quote, just followed orders, close quote. So escaping Nazis found plenty of anonymous help towards that end, and Nazi scientists who didn't want to come to America were allowed into Syria and into Egypt, where they helped build weapons to fight the Israelis. More than a few Christians at the time had seen the Holocaust as the inevitable unfolding of God's plan that was prophesied in the book of Revelation, and to get the chosen people back to the Holy Land, Jeremiah had written that God would first send the fishermen, and then he would send the hunters. Therefore, behold, the days come, said the Lord, that it shall no longer be said, the Lord lives, that caused the sons of Israel to come up out of the land of Egypt, but that the Lord lives, that caused the sons of Israel to come up out of the land of the north wind, and from all the lands where he had driven them, and I will bring them again into the land that I gave unto their fathers. Behold, I send many fishers, saith the Lord, and they shall fish them. And after I will send many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill, and out of the holes of the rocks. Jubilee Bible 2000, Jeremiah 16:14-16. Were the Germans able to do the math in 1935, they would have understood what Einstein had just discovered, that time is the fourth dimension, and death the event horizon of time, the limit and impetus of being, and Speer blamed mere technology for the Nazis' rise to power, the loudspeaker, the radio, the telephone, and the telegram. And if that were true, what might advances in technology bring in the future, particularly towards a resurgence of Nazism? According to Heidegger, within the danger lies the rescue, so bring on the science. The Red Chinese would blame the radio for the Tiananmen Square riots in 1976 that were held in the spring just before Mao died. And in the Chinese language, the pictogram for democracy and mob were the same. And in 30 AD, the Jews hadn't been able to find anyone who could accuse Jesus convincingly before the high priests, so they had accused him as a mob.